Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our latest webinar. I'm Alex Turner from thebusinessdesk.com. It's great to have so many of you with us this morning. Our theme for the next hour is reviving the Northern Powerhouse economy, and it's particularly timely to talk about the strengths of the North and some of the opportunities and how the new economy might look. You'll have hopefully seen on the Business Desk email this morning, our top story was around a deal between the Boohoo founder, Mahmood Kamani, financier Richard Hughes, and the Yorkshire Life Sciences business of Actor, looking to do a direct-to-consumer test for COVID-19. And I think it's a really good example of, some of the expertise and the resources that exist in the North, and how actually we've got many of the characteristics and attributes that can make the economy respond and thrive in the months and years ahead. But clearly we are going to move into a very different economy and potentially different society than we've been used to over the last few years. And our speakers this morning are going to touch on some of the different facets of that, and what we are likely to see, what business is likely to see, and how it might need to respond, and how it can get involved in helping to push the Northern Powerhouse and the Northern economy forward. Our speakers this morning will address a range of issues. So just to briefly introduce them, we've got Matthew Kirk from Squire Patton Boggs European Public Policy Team. We've got Henri Murison from the Northern Powerhouse Partnership, Helen Boyle from Electricity Northwest, and Francesca Fellowes, also from Squire Patton Boggs. And I said they will talk on a range of issues from economy, the regional economy, green economy, the data security and the test, trace, isolate, and its impact for business. But to kick things off, Matthew's going to start and give his view on from his public policy perspective. So Matthew, over to you.
Thank you very much, and good morning everyone, and great to be with you this morning. I'd like to talk a little bit about how I would be looking at this if I was in government today. I spent the early part of my career in government, and sorry, I seem to have lost the video for a moment there. I spent the first 25 years of my career in government, and I think this is a moment of extraordinary policy challenge, obviously, and one which the government will be thinking very carefully, not only about the short term, how do we unlock the lockdown, get the economy moving again as far as we can, but also thinking further, how do we turn this moment into a moment of opportunity, and look at how that affects the future. And so I'm going to try and look at that a bit from a government perspective, obviously with the Northern Powerhouse in mind. And I'm going to build on the comments that my colleague James Wharton made last week, for those of you who were on the webinar last week. But just for anyone who wasn't, let me start by very quickly answering a question which James dealt with at much greater length, which is, does the government still have the ambition for the Northern Powerhouse? I think, as James explained, the rhetoric around Northern Powerhouse has changed. That rhetoric belonged more to previous Conservative governments, but I don't think the ambition has, and I think you can see it in the government's levelling up agenda, and that certainly hasn't disappeared despite the deviation that we have taken through the coronavirus pandemic. So question one, is the ambition still there to have something substantive that changes, that happens, that develops across the North? Yes, absolutely. I think that's a critical part of the levelling up agenda. Second, where in the sort of scheme of things, very important part of the Northern Powerhouse is this idea of infrastructure investment. Where does that fit in the government's overall priorities? Well, I think this government will look at recovery from this recession in a very different way to the way in which the last government looked at recovery from the recession caused by the financial crisis. And these are very different kinds of recession. I think the government will put a big emphasis on infrastructure investment, and the idea of infrastructure investment across the north is clearly a critical part of that, as well as being a critically important part of the whole Northern Powerhouse concept. So again, I think a broadly cautious sense that the ambition for infrastructure will not disappear. And third sort of critical question you'd be looking at if you were in government is, how can we afford all this? The public finances will be probably in a worse condition as we come out of the pandemic crisis than they've been since the end of the Second World War. And you would think that in those situations, the government natural reaction would be to rein back on expenditure, save money wherever you can. I think there are quite a lot of reasons why the government would not do that this time. The first is that to recover the public finances as quickly as possible, you need a growing economy. And given that the causes of this recession are very different, this is in effect a self-imposed recession, not one caused by structural weaknesses in the economy. The need to get the economy going again and to re-establish a pattern of growth as quickly as possible is very strong. The second thing is about the financing of debt. The reason that governments typically like to try and keep debt under control is that if it gets out of control, you can't afford it. But government borrowing costs are exceptionally low at the moment. And interestingly, as we've gone through the coronavirus crisis, lockdown, all the rest of it, and government borrowing has ballooned, the cost of borrowing has not gone up significantly. The financial markets do not at the moment look particularly concerned about the British government's long-term capacity to repay its debt. So there is quite a lot of reason for arguing that while some areas of current government expenditure will undoubtedly come under extreme pressure as we come out of the crisis and as they look through a comprehensive spending review, probably around the end of this year, beginning of next year, at how they can spend money in the future. The current areas of expenditure, I think, will come under a lot of scrutiny. But big capital investment projects, I think, could well have a good deal of impetus behind them, and the government could well see that as, in many ways, the most effective way in which government can spend money to get the economy going again. So what will they be interested in the North doing? And I've got sort of 5 things here, all of which in one way or another come out of COVID-19 and come out of the situation that we find ourselves in. The first, and Alex, you gave a great example in your introduction, the really obvious one is health and life sciences. We have found that in a number of critical areas, we have absolutely world-leading capacity in the UK, extraordinary R&D capability and so forth. But in a number of other areas critical to the health and well-being supply chain, we are very vulnerable. And so I think building up industries, services that support health and life sciences. It's interesting also how the Prime Minister personally, as a great opponent of the nanny state, until quite recently, because of his personal experience of coronavirus and the link between coronavirus and weight, has now become a tremendous enthusiast for us to become a healthier nation as well. And so that broad area of the hard end of health, drugs and medical research, medical devices and so forth, right through to lifestyle and lifestyle support, I think is an obvious area where there will be demand, and where, to the extent that the government is able to use levers to incentivize investment, it would want to do so. Second one, within the broad infrastructure envelope, I think the way in which cities develop, smart cities, I think also there will probably be some rethinking of real estate, starting within corporations, as people have looked at how we have been able to work actually very effectively remotely, a large proportion of the working population. What are the implications of that for real estate? How do you rethink the physical side of the working life, and what does that mean in terms of where people live, where their children go to school, how they get to and from work, how often they get to and from work, when they get to and from work, and so forth. So all of that links into a smart city, smart transport agenda, which I think will be enormously important going forward. Third one is climate change. We've just conducted an absolutely massive unintentional experiment in carbon reduction. I think as we come back into economic activity, we've got used to living with clean air. The government's ambitions for climate change and for developing that as a key sector of the economy will be very strong. Fourth one, obviously, is digital, and in that I would put not just the sort of the obvious digital, broadband and so forth, but the use of digital in industry and services, artificial intelligence, robotics, data analytics, data science in general, and cyber, which my colleague Francesca will be talking about later. And finally, linked to all of that, I think there will be a big focus on universities and skills, and helping universities, which have a huge challenge coming out of the crisis, huge financial challenge, but also a need to reestablish their purpose within the community and show how they contribute. I think there will be a tremendous drive on the way in which universities develop skills and help people either adapt to or get themselves into this new shape of the economy. I will stop at that point, Alex. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you, Matthew, for that. I think that provides a really useful overview of the government's policy, thoughts, and its potential future direction. Just wanted to flag up to our audience, there is the option for questions as we go along. We'll have 10 minutes or so at the end for a Q&A session with the panel. So if you have any questions, just click the Q&A button that's at the bottom of your screen, and we will come to those later on. Our second speaker is Henri Murison, who'll be familiar to most of you as the Chief Executive of the Northern Powerhouse Partnership. If you don't know Henri, he's been a leading player in keeping the kind of needs and demands of the North at the front of the government's mind, and also perhaps doing the more important job of linking together the different organisations of the North and trying to get everybody behind a common agenda that benefits the economy as a whole. So if I could hand over to Henri for your thoughts on how we revive the Northern Powerhouse economy.
Really good morning, and thanks so much for having me join you this morning with Business Desk colleagues. I think as the Northern Powerhouse Partnership, clearly we've been around for over 3 years now, making the case for what economic rebalancing could contribute to the national economy and to the national life of the UK. And that argument's never been more relevant than it is now. And I think as we come out of what has been a terrible health crisis, I kind of want to prefix everything I've got to say today by kind of paying tribute to all those who've played a part in the emergency response, including many key workers, not just in the public sector, but from many members of the partnership. So businesses that have continued working throughout this Drax over the Pennines in Yorkshire, and obviously Helen and her colleagues at Electricity North West, another example of many of the sectors like energy who've been continuing to work so hard to keep us all safe and able to keep working, who maybe haven't got the degree of attention that others have rightly got as well. But I think we need to acknowledge that, and it's great to have some of those people on the call with us. So the argument we would make is we, over the past couple of weeks with YouGov, polled Northerners to find out what they thought. And I think that clearly the Chancellor's commitment last week to not forget levelling up is massively important for the Northern Powerhouse. And as Matthew's rightly alluded to in his remarks, as someone who's kind of listening to some of the things that James Wharton was saying last week, I think James was absolutely on point, that clearly the Northern Powerhouse was a narrative of a Conservative Chancellor at the time, who's now our chair, George Osborne, and still very much a supporter of the project. But that project is now owned by us here in the North, by our business leaders, by our civic leaders, by our metro mayors. And rightly, the government isn't just going to be able to decide whether levelling up, which is their kind of political project, constitutes enough to achieve that Northern Powerhouse vision of a rebalanced economy, because actually now there's a number of us who are stakeholders to that goal and have a role to play in achieving it, and we're going to have to work together to do that. And I think that's a really positive kind of a bit of evidence for what the Northern Powerhouse has achieved, which is actually to get people on a common agenda and contributing, whether that's through public investment or private investment, to achieving some long-term goals. So the polling evidence is quite interesting, because it showed that about more than half of people in the North were prepared to pay more tax or see other spending choices in order to enable economic rebalancing to happen, in order to give us the jobs and infrastructure which will also help us to recover from coronavirus. When it came to specific policy areas, there was also very high support for more elected mayors and giving them more power. So of those who gave an opinion, over half supported more powers, less than a quarter opposed it. So there was a strong preference, and obviously we actually divided that across the North, and broadly, whether you were in an area that had devolution or not, you had a positive opinion of it. And that reflects the fact that even if you don't live in Greater Manchester or in Liverpool City region, many people in the Northwest have seen the benefit of having those strong voices like Andy Burnham and Steve Rotherham. And that's why in Cumbria, for instance, where we're working hard to achieve devolution, as well as in Cheshire and Warrington as another example, not just local political leaders, but actually local business leaders have made the case really strongly, not just during this crisis, but before it, that there would be real opportunities for their businesses if they had that strong local leadership, which also convened that business voice and was able to amplify some of the place issues which need to be resolved in order to unlock the higher productivity that will pay the higher taxes, that will help us pay back the costs that we've incurred during this crisis. Because clearly, an economy like the one we had before is going to struggle to deal with the legacy of this crisis economically. A more productive, successful economy is going to pay back that deficit more quickly. And I mean, that's kind of basic maths, but it's a principle about investing in something rather than pulling away. And again, I think Matthew's remarks were pretty much on point around the likely direction that government policy is going to take. And levelling up, I think, will be the clear frame that certainly the Chancellor approaches this through. So I think what's particularly kind of interesting is that when you ask people specifically what they wanted to do as part of the recovery, they were quite clear actually in giving some strong opinions. So people were very supportive of the idea of spending more on training and making sure that we help reskill people. And clearly that's a key competence of our Northern mayors. So Andy Burnham already has, along with Steve Rotherham, control the skills budget, and Greater Manchester in particular have very well developed plans for how they could spend not just new money, but better deploy the money that's already been spent. And I would use the example of people having to resit their English and maths qualifications, particularly sort of difficult to imagine that being useful when many of those 16-year-olds who will be judged to have not achieved the required standard will never actually have sat the exam. And so I think we're going to have to be very inventive about what interventions we do put in place to help people get those key skills around English and maths, potentially just getting them to resit an exam they never actually didn't get the right result in the first time is maybe not the right solution. So I think we need to give local places a lot more autonomy in how they spend what are limited sums of money on what will be a huge demand based on yesterday's unemployment figures, not just in the north of England, but across the country. But clearly that demand is most acute in the north because we know in our key sectors from work we've done at the partnership that we were already under the national average in skill levels, even in those sectors like energy and manufacturing where we're world leading. So even though we might have many of the assets, we're also underskilled in those areas. There was also significant support for transition towards green energy. And so 7 out of 10 Northerners also supported that proposal. And that could obviously include carbon capture, use and storage. But again, thinking about the Northwest Nuclear Arc and some of our assets in the Sheffield City region, for instance, around manufacturing that could support that, businesses like Forge Masters, you could see that small modular reactors under the consortium led by those such as Rolls-Royce could deliver real benefits. That received very high support as well. And the other area that achieved particular support was reskilling children. So one of the challenges we identified and that we researched this week from the Institute for Fiscal Studies has also highlighted is a significant gap that's emerging amongst those from the most disadvantaged communities in terms of what they missed in school and school learning. And I think the IFS have calculated that it's at least a seven full days of gap. And obviously there's already a huge issue with those from the most disadvantaged communities falling behind in our education system. So this is not to diminish the kind of importance of infrastructure like full fibre to the premises, which is something it takes 5 weeks to train someone to lay full fibre. We could do quickly. That money was already going to be spent by the government. That's about accelerating existing plans, or for instance, building projects like Northern Powerhouse Rail and HS2 as part of the new high-speed rail network. Clearly those things are still important, but I think the public also sees that Northern Powerhouse agenda needs to be broader than perhaps where it started over 5 years ago now. And to achieve economic productivity, Lord O'Neill, Jim O'Neill, who worked for George Osborne of the Treasury, was very clear from the beginning when he wrote his Cities Growth Commission report that came before the kind of brand of the Northern Powerhouse, led by those northern cities, but also other core cities across the UK. He was very clear in articulating he needed that broader agenda, including the power of local leadership. And I think that the role of our mayors coming out of this crisis will be absolutely vital. And certainly as a partnership, we'll be working closely with those people to achieve what we need, which is a recovery that not only puts back what has been broken, but enables the country to move forward. And I think as a partnership, we'll be sharing kind of our thoughts about the recovery very widely over the coming few days and weeks, because we think this is a historic opportunity, particularly in areas like shovel-ready infrastructure, where if you are going to, for instance, upgrade the rail line between Manchester and onto Leeds and York, what better time to do it than when very few people are using it? And so what we don't want to do is create jobs in, say, a year, when we could create them in the coming months. What we also don't want to do is have an infrastructure building programme in the north that comes immediately after a period of very significant challenges in terms of social distancing, because clearly some of the costs of infrastructure is short-term disruption. And I think there isn't a better time to do some of that work, particularly on the railway, where there is capacity to do it. And I think as we look at the North's particular infrastructure requirements, whether it's the West Cumbrian line, whether it's Transpennine route upgrades, there are some really specific examples that we'll be pushing in the coming days. And I do hope that businesses that see the importance of those projects, whether it's for freight or for passenger travel, so to enable people to draw people from a wider area when people do start going back to our offices when the current crisis starts to subside slightly more, we need to be able to make that articulation and that argument. But that isn't at the expense of long-term investment in areas like energy. And I know that particularly with those like Helen on the call, we've got the real opportunity to talk about decarbonisation, which I do think, because again, the country was going to have to pay for that anyway, in terms of that transition, the North was already going to play a leading role in driving that. There isn't a better time to take the initiative and demonstrate to the rest of the country what the North can do for them, for the wider economic challenge that we face, rather than seeing economic rebalancing, so levelling up, and the needs of the recovery as two separate, very significant costs on government. Actually, they're one ask, and they're an ask in which private sector investment will play as big a role if we can leverage that as public sector investment.
That's great. Thank you very much, Henry, for that. And I think that aim of a more successful and productive economy is something that we can all support. But I suppose one of the changes in recent weeks is perhaps a greater nuance in what people think in terms of what a successful economy actually means. And sustainability and climate change has had an increasingly loud voice over the last couple of years, and I think the changes during the lockdown period has made us, reassess many of the things that we do. So delighted this morning to be joined by Helen Boyle, who's the Strategic Decarbonisation Manager for Electricity Northwest, who has a key role in how the region innovates and responds to some of these challenges. So Helen, over to you.
Thank you very much, and also thank you very much for having me here this morning. So just couple of things I just wanted to pick up right at the start. Thank you very much, Henry, for the thanking all our workers. You're absolutely right. We've got 2,000 people who work for us who have all continued to work during the crisis and keep the electricity flowing so people can carry on working at home and hopefully live their lives as best that they can given the current situation. So I do really appreciate that. Thank you. I think it's really positive and really interesting to hear the points around how we'll start to transition in terms of kickstarting the economy, and the part that the green agenda plays in all of that, which absolutely plugs right into the work that we've been doing for the last 18 months or so. So just a bit of a background and explanation as to who Electricity Northwest are. We are the distribution network operator for the Northwest region. Sorry, I've just realised that I think my video might have stopped.
No, you're all good.
All good. Right, perfect. Okay. So we're the distribution network operator for the Northwest region. So we own, operate and maintain the electricity infrastructure right up from the borders of Scotland down to the Peak District. We are funded for the work that we do through customers' electricity bills. So around £85 a year of a customer's electricity bill that they pay to an electricity supplier goes to fund what we do. So customers pay their bills to E.ON or EDF or British Gas or whoever their supplier is, and the money comes to us to carry out the work that we do. And we invest about £1 million a day in the electricity network to keep all the electricity flowing to customers' homes and businesses across the region. And it's a key point that we're I suppose, talking particularly, very interesting to hear what Henri was saying about private sector and all of this, because businesses use 2/3 of the electricity. So it's really key that actually something that we're doing when we're starting to think about how we restart the economy and focusing on the green agenda is engaging businesses in all of that and helping them to understand the part that they can play in this and why it's important for them, both from a sustainability perspective, but also a reputational point of view. So over the last 18 months or so, we've been doing a lot of business-to-business engagement with local authorities to understand the role that Electricity Northwest can play in the decarbonisation of the region. What we know is that as we start to move away from our reliance on fossil fuels, demand for electricity is set to grow by, it's set to double in the next 20 years. As we move away from fossil fuels and we start to use connect more low carbon technologies to the network, we know that demand will double. So what that means is Electricity Northwest has a huge role to play in ensuring that that transition to a net zero economy works in a stable, secure and affordable way for our customers. So we started to have dialogue with big businesses, local authorities, our customers, to say what role is it that we can play in this moving forward. I think Henri's point around metro mayors is a really, really interesting one, and one that we would definitely echo. Conversations as well that we've had with Lancashire recently is also that they're looking to move towards a metro mayor structure. And the reason that that's so important is that what it does is it brings together all the different sectors across the economy in behind one figurehead and one voice and one political ambition. It collectively brings all of that together, helps to engage all the different parties, attracts the investments that's needed in order to deliver this and move forward. Because otherwise, what happens is it's hard to align and have the consistency across the different sectors unless you've set a very clear goal and you've got a structure of a team of people and somebody to work behind in order to deliver it. A key example that if you look at this where it's worked really well, when it, particularly looking at energy, is in Scotland. So Scotland have a really clear ambition around becoming carbon neutral for their energy supply by 2045, which is 5 years ahead of the rest of the UK. And actually it's practically achieved it already, because what it did is it saw this as an engagement campaign. So it aligned political vision and the policy framework needed to enable that green energy transition, private sector, public sector, and also people behind a common aim, and saw it as an engagement opportunity, brought everybody together and worked towards that aim. And it's something that has been really, really successful. So we've been working over the last 12 months or so with the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, which is the 10 local authorities within Greater Manchester, working together with obviously Andy Burnham as the Metro Mayor as the head of that. So they have an ambition to be carbon neutral by 2038. So as the distribution network operator for the Northwest, what role do we play in enabling their ambitions? So there is a juxtaposition. People will know that the UK is on a trajectory to become carbon neutral from its by 2050. That's the UK's legal target that obviously feeds into the Paris Climate Change Agreement. But Greater Manchester have decided that actually they want to be more ambitious than that. They want to show leadership. So they've decided that they want to be carbon neutral by 2038. So we've been working with them to say, if the national grid won't actually be decarbonised to 2050, but your ambition is to bring that forward by 12 years, what is it that you need to do in Greater Manchester in order to ensure that your electricity and energy supply is carbon neutral by that date? And actually what we're saying, and I think this is a key opportunity for businesses as we start to build back better, is that this is about the growth of locally connected renewables. So Greater Manchester already has an ambition from its 5-year environment plan to grow that sector, but it needs to really focus on now at both a local and a national level to ensure that that happens. So what is it from a policy perspective that they can do locally to enable the growth of locally connected renewables, things like solar PV and wind turbines across the region? And what is it that actually may stop that from a national policy perspective? Because national policy is on a 2050 timeline, whereas they're obviously working to a much quicker one. So what lobbying do they need to do of national government? And equally, what is it that national government can do at the minute to take stock and almost say, well, if our regions want to go faster and show more leadership in this area, what is it that we can do at a national policy level to help and enable that to happen? And actually what we're seeing is we really don't expect, if I'm honest, that 2050 target to stay as it is. We're also hearing that Cumbria is looking to ratify a 2037 target for Cumbria as a county. So what does that mean for Lancashire? You already see lots of cities having a more accelerated ambition. Oxford, Bristol, they're all cities that come out, and Nottingham as well is in the press a lot recently around being more aggressive on its timeline to become net zero. So what is it now, if we're focusing on recovery in a green way, that the government can do to accelerate that transition and provide a national policy framework that means that all the different sectors that need to come together to deliver this can do so quickly and easily? And bear in mind that this transition needs to happen actually very, very quickly, because Greater Manchester, it's only 18 years away that it has its carbon neutral ambition, but it currently only generates from locally connected renewables 1% of its own demand. So that means that it needs to get to the point where the local generation is netting off what it's drawing in. So demand and supply need to be decarbonised. So it's a big challenge, but also a really massive opportunity, I think, for all the different facets of the economy to come together to work towards a really key aim. I think another point that I'd like to pick up on as well that's been echoed before is around skills. It's a big concern of ours as a large employer across the region that we ensure that our local people in the Northwest and in the wider context of the North really benefit from the growth of the green skills. That if we are focusing on a green recovery, what are the skills that we need? What are the jobs of the future, and how are we embedding that across all our education levels? And what is it that we as employers, so what part does private sector have to play in this? And I think actually that private sector has a really key role in helping the education authorities to understand what the jobs of the future will look like. So I think that engagement really has yet to happen when it's coming specifically around green skills. But I think it's a key one, because otherwise what will happen is that the green jobs will be filled by other areas, by local people from other areas of the UK rather than the North. So I think that's an absolutely crucial question that we've got to grapple with. And again, I think it would be really helpful to engage all the different public sector, private sector, and obviously education providers to understand how they can all work together to get that delivered. So I think it's a very interesting time. I think in terms of the work that we're doing at Electricity Northwest around providing information, impartial information to help others to adopt and invest in low carbon technologies is something that we expect to see growing. Because what stakeholders have said to us is that they're not sure what technologies to adopt. They're not sure whether to invest in hybrid heat pumps. They're not sure what the future of gas will look like, what the future of hydrogen will look like, how what's the impact of the growth in low carbon technologies on the electricity grid. What are we doing about that? So we've been collaborating with Cadent, one of the gas supply companies in the Northwest, to provide that surety for local authorities and for larger businesses to say, this is what the future of energy looks like. And actually, if you're looking to accelerate that decarbonisation, these are the actions that you as a local authority need to take, that businesses need to take, that we as energy infrastructure providers need to take in order to deliver the political ambition that's already been set. So that's some clarity that we're looking to provide, and I think that there's only us as energy providers that can do that, because what that does as well is informs our investment planning as we move forward into our next price control, which starts in 2023. So what we'd like to think is that by providing that surety, providing that clarity of around technology, particularly given the short to near-term future around energy, it will help local authorities, it will help businesses to invest in low carbon technologies and really accelerate that transition and work towards the net zero goal, really.
That's great. Thank you very much, Helen, for that. I think that the long-term ambition and opportunity of decarbonisation will become increasingly urgent in the years ahead, and we look forward to following your progress with that. Our final speaker before I bring the panel back for a Q&A at the end is Francesca Fellowes. Francesca is a director in Squire Patton Boggs' data privacy and cybersecurity team. And as the government rolls out its test, trace, isolate strategy, business will have a role to play in sharing some of that burden. And for example, the deal that I mentioned at the start, it is one example of how businesses will be able to get their hands potentially on tests, so which opens up a whole myriad of issues and challenges for business owners and business leaders in how they treat that data and what they do with it. And in today's cybersecurity breach news, following EasyJet's problems of yesterday, Serco have had their own problems with not being able to control data around the contact tracers. So these are very timely issues for business and have the possibility of being overlooked as we worry around about some of the other issues, but is of critical importance. So Francesca, over to you.
Thank you, Alex, and good morning to everybody who's joined us today. So as Alex said, I'm here to talk about some of the privacy implications of some of the measures, the key measures that businesses will need and want to take as the lockdown lifts and they try to get their employees back to work safely. So some of the measures that might want to be taken, including things like temperature testing, thermal imaging cameras, testing employees, as Alex mentioned, will have implications from a privacy perspective because they involve the use of personal data. So that's data relating to employees and other individuals. And these, the processing of personal data is governed by data protection laws. Data protection laws, as you might imagine, are not there to create a barrier between you taking measures that you need to take in order to get people back to work safely as the lockdown lifts, but they do require you to ensure that the use of personal data is necessary and proportionate, and that it's fair, lawful, and fully transparent. And so looking at some of these measures that we might want to take, so one of them that's very much hitting the headlines at the moment is the use of track and trace apps. So there's the NHS X app, which, as unfortunately been rather delayed, it appears. But that's going to be potentially one of the key measures which helps us to get back to work safely, because it allows us to track and trace and isolate those that are infected or have been in contact with those infected with the virus. So many employers may well be keen for their employees to use this and download and use this track and trace app once it's up and running. And they'll also want and need to know if one of their employees has received an alert via the app, bring them to isolate because they've recently been in contact with somebody who has been infected with the virus. Now, the privacy implications of that are, of course, that involves you dealing with health data potentially, but use of that information is likely to comply with data protection laws on the basis that it's necessary to enable you to comply with obligations of health and safety and other obligations under employment laws. Because, for example, you'll need to know if somebody receives an alert within your workforce, because you'll need to make arrangements for them to either work from home if they can do, or to take sickness absence if they can't during their isolation period. So there's been a delay in the rollout of the NHS X app. We've heard over the last couple of days. It could be another few weeks. We know that a lot of businesses have already implemented their own track and trace apps, or if they haven't, they're seriously considering doing so. And these are on the market, often as part of a wider solution to combat the spread of the virus within the workforce and deal with the risks as people get back to work. Now, obviously there are privacy issues when rolling out these apps, because you are essentially monitoring employees' movements and also collecting health data if they report that they've been tested positive for the virus or been in contact with somebody who has. The NHS app has been designed very much with privacy in mind, as you might imagine. So, for example, it strictly limits the scope of personal data that's collected, data that actually identifies individuals, because it uses anonymous Bluetooth identifiers to match the devices, as opposed to using GPS, for example, which would track location data, which is much more intrusive. It also strictly limits the data that's kept stored centrally. So instead, a lot of the data is stored on the device itself, which is less privacy intrusive. And of course, access is primarily restricted to the NHS, which is a public health authority, has a very strong legitimate need to get that information in order to fight the pandemic. So as a business, if you roll out one of these apps to your employees, you need to ensure that it complies with data protection laws. You as the controller, as opposed to the app developer or provider, will have the obligations under data protection laws to make sure that it's fair, that it's lawful, and that it's transparent. And so you need to do some due diligence before rolling out one of these. So you need to speak with the app developer or whoever is providing it to you, see their data protection impact assessment, make sure that it complies with data protection laws, make sure that there is full transparency to employees about how their data will be used as a result of it. And one of the key benefits to this, not only, or all of the measures that I'm going to talk about, is not only that it reduces the risk of enforcement action and potential claims once the dust is settled, it also demonstrates to your employees that during your response to the pandemic and during the unlocking measures, you are going to use their data responsibly. And therefore, this is reassuring to them, and you'll get many more employees on board, which will then lead to a much more successful strategy to fight the virus within the organisation. Some of the key measures that you need to take to pay due regard to data privacy and make sure the right balance is struck between complying with your health and safety obligations to fight the virus and get people ensure people are safe and the right of privacy are, for example, data protection impact assessments. Now, this is an assessment to ensure that the processing of personal data, the use of personal data pursuant to the measures, is necessary and proportionate in light of the aim that you're trying to achieve. And also that you can comply with your data protection obligations when you're processing personal data to carry out these measures. Now, these assessments are mandatory under the GDPR in certain circumstances where you're processing high-risk data. Health data is one of the factors that leads to something being high risk, and so is the fact that you're dealing with vulnerable individuals. Employees are classed under data protection laws as vulnerable individuals. So that is erring towards it being higher risk. So if you're dealing with health data, when you're doing temperature testing, or you're testing, you're engaging in testing for the virus, employees and things, measures of that kind of nature, then you may well need to carry out one of these impact assessments to avoid enforcement action. But also, they're a very, very useful tool just to run through and ensure that you're striking the right balance there between health and safety and privacy. Privacy notices are important. Transparency is a key obligation under data protection laws. And what that requires is to make sure that employees and any others that you're processing data about are fully aware of how you're going to process their data, what you're going to use it for, who'll have access to it, how long you're going to retain it for. All of those things need to be communicated to employees. And what this means in practice is to supplement or amend your existing employee privacy notice, for example, to make sure that you're still covering off all of those these new uses of data to fight the pandemic. If you use thermal imaging cameras, for example, you need clear signs where the cameras are sited so that people are fully aware when they walk into a building that they're going to be subjected to this thermal imaging. They know about it and they know who to contact if they want further information. In terms of lawful basis, because you need a lawful basis whenever processing personal data, really here what you're going to be looking at is that you need to process the data to comply with your health and safety obligations in relation to your employees and others. Relying on consent, which is sometimes this kind of obvious fallback position for many clients, is not really workable in this situation, because consent has to be freely given in order to be valid under data protection laws. And there is a perceived imbalance of power between an employee and employer, which really sort of creates the perception that consent is unlikely to be valid in this situation. So instead, limit what the use of personal data to what you need to comply with your health and safety obligations, and then that allows you to satisfy a lawful basis for use. And then finally, data security is obviously key, particularly when you're dealing with health data, and data minimization is also something that should be adhered to. And what that means is you do strictly limit the scope of the personal data collected, the use of it, the access to it, and the retention of it to what is strictly needed in order to comply with the health and safety obligations. So just as a brief summary, it's a matter of identifying where you're going to be using personal data as part of these measures, and just taking some key compliance measures to make sure that the right balance is struck between the health and safety obligations and respect to the right of privacy.
That's great. Thank you very much, Francesca. I think in this very fast-changing world, it's really timely and useful overview of what businesses need to both be thinking about, but also implementing, along with all the other challenges that are filling up our days at the moment. I'd like to bring back the rest of the panel now, and we've got about 10 minutes for a Q&A, and I know we've had a number of questions already come through. A lot of these questions, Henri, are grouped around the issue of a fairer economy. So, for example, the sacrifices that will need to be made to refinance the COVID-related debts, the impact of opportunities in the jobs market, and then specifically the challenges that our young adults now face into the world that they're coming into. So how does the North ensure as best it can that it builds as fair an economy in the future?
I think Andy and Steve have rightly highlighted these issues as well, which I think is really welcome. So, I mean, I think I would look at some of the projects you mentioned, private sector initiatives that were announced this morning. Obviously, the Oakview Group are building their new arena in Manchester. That's working with their construction partners, going to soften the blow by 20% in construction in terms of the downturn. So I think what you've got to think about is young people need jobs now. So we think back to the Future Jobs Fund, which the Brown government introduced, and I remember very well and remember promoting and talking about, and I remember how much it helped people of my generation who were affected by the downturn in the financial crisis. We need something, I think, with even greater ambition and scale than that. And I think what I would allude to is that there are public sector projects that we can accelerate, but private sector employers need to give hope as well as the public sector. So if we commit to do some really bold, exciting things, not just in infrastructure, but across the economy, that are going to give people something to get excited about, then they're going to believe that it's worth going to college or worth going to university in order to get the skills to get those jobs, or they're going to apply for those great high quality apprenticeships. But the reality is, if we're not doing anything in the economy, we're not going to generate those opportunities. And so I think there's as much of an opportunity, and obviously there are a number of businesses like Electricity North West that are regulated entities, right? Well, government needs to give them the flexibility and encourage them across all energy and wider sectors to bring forward projects. Because why on earth would we not spend money now that and incentivize that, right? Because if you own an asset that's going to be performing for 20, 30 years, then we need to be dramatically accelerating some of the things that might, for instance, be in the ED2 business plan for a business like Electricity North West, and do them now. That's an applied example, but I think it applies across the economy, and government needs to pull all the levers it has, but it's also, we need to give more levers to our metro mayors and also have more decision making at the northern level for sectors like energy, because I think Helen really well demonstrated how she's brought together a consensus across her local authorities and combined authority partners. But I think what's really challenging is, how do we demonstrate to government that we can make, where there's a broad consensus across places, that we can take levers that have historically been national and deploy them at the northern level to get stuff moving? Because my worry, I think, is that if the Chancellor was on this call, I think he'd agree with everything we're saying. The problem is that Rishi's not in every meeting and every room. And how do we take his intent and purpose around levelling up and apply it to every decision made in the public sector and the private sector in the next few years? And I think if we create the right environment and give the North and our metro mayors significantly more power, then I think we can do it. And I don't actually think it's necessarily about spending more money. I think when I spoke to the Yorkshire Post the weekend, I was really clear. The North doesn't want lots more money. What we want are the existing spending powers that people like Richard Leese have articulated that Greater Manchester has wanted for decades, and spend the existing funding better, but also bring forward things that the government's already going to have to spend money on, or private sector businesses that are regulated or unregulated are going to have anyway, and do them much more quickly. And that's going to require regulators, it's going to require much more devolution, it's going to require a lot of people to let go and give that policy bandwidth that the North can provide and our mayors can provide the scope to do what it should, which is to make levelling up a reality, not just an idea.
Matthew, on that question of, the government has its intent and purpose and has set out its levelling up agenda, but on the question of, effectively, has it got the ability to follow through and deliver real results? What's your take on that?
Well, I think what Henri's raised is very, very interesting indeed. The key question for me, looking at how government operates now and how you draw lessons out of how government has operated through this crisis, is the devolution one. Will Whitehall be willing to bring about the kind of devolution that Henri was talked about? From where I sit, I would be tremendously enthusiastic for that. I think there is always a concern in central government that you look at how debt can be established through local authorities, and you can find that your debt position gets out of control. So I think there will be an attempt, particularly given the scale of debt we've got, to try and keep some level of control over how much the nation ends up being indebted. But my hope would be that actually the need for locally tailored solutions has been really reinforced through the experience of the pandemic within a national framework, obviously. So the big infrastructure projects have to be done at a national level because they make sense at a national level. But there's a great deal that can be done locally which have a tremendous impact. And if you can get the two working in harmony, you achieve the greatest impact. So I hope there will be a push for greater decentralization. I think there are some around the Prime Minister who are enthusiastic for that. I also think it responds to something about how democracy operates, which is quite deeply entrenched in the Conservative Party heritage. So I'm not sort of cautiously optimistic, let's say, that we'll see some further moves in that area.
Great. And Helen, I saw you nodding along while Henri and Matthew were speaking. So how does a business like yours play its role?
So some of the issues that you've just raised there are the ones that we're grappling with at the minute, and I think it's a big question for the regulator, Ofgem in our particular case, if I'm just thinking about us as a business, to get its head around. So we first started talking to Ofgem and BEIS back in June, July time last year, and we were talking about decarbonisation and the important role that DNO should play in that. And actually the rhetoric or the response that we were getting at that time was, oh, this is very, very interesting, and then we think it's great, not really sure what our role is in all of that, so go on, get on with it, brilliant. But in terms of the regulator, they didn't really understand actually the role that they needed to play in order to make that happen. The rhetoric has changed significantly now. So since the CEO has changed from Dermot Nolan to Jonathan Brearley, on Jonathan Brearley's first day, he launched his decarbonisation action plan, and this sets out everything that Ofgem needs to do over the next 18 months in order to run up to the next price control period, in order to facilitate the transition to net zero. One of the key things that Ofgem recognises is that it's not flexible enough, it's not adaptable, it's not flexible as a regulator, in order to, it's not at the moment got the right framework that we need to operate within in order to deliver net zero for the regions that DNOs operate within. And also this idea that within an operating area, different cities or different regions want to go at different paces is a really tough one for them to get their heads around, but they absolutely know that is the right way to go. But what they need to understand and work out is what policy structure do you put in place to enable DNOs to do that and play the role that our big stakeholders in our region are asking us to play. So it's not that, you know, we've set this ambition, it's that Greater Manchester has set its ambition, and Cumbria is about to do the same, and I'll be absolutely certain that Lancashire will too. So how do we support that? And that goes back to that national policy framework, ensuring that we can act quickly and make the investments that we need in order to help make all of that happen, really.
And a lot of the positive change that we hope will come will be, will come out of investment, particularly R&D investment. And Matthew, a question for you from Lisa was, do you think the government's ambition to double R&D expenditure is now under threat?
No, I think they will absolutely want, it's part of the sort of vision of the modernization of the economy. And you've had, quite recently an important innovation in how government spends its R&D expenditure with the creation of UCRI, UK Research and Investment, which pulls together all the R&D budgets, which were all sitting in lots of different places, and means that they can actually be much more strategic in working out how they spend that money. I think alongside that, they will be keen also to preserve the R&D capacity of universities, because that's a key part of our university sector remaining a very high performance sector, and its ability to deliver for the economy. So I would say that if you're sitting in government looking at what contributes to the kind of economy we want to have in the future, R&D will be extremely important. There are quite good examples in the past of countries in a deep recession which have increased, in some cases even doubled their R&D budgets, and the result of that has been a much more modern, much more dynamic economy as you come out of the recession.
That's great. Thank you, Matthew. Oh, unfortunately, our hour is up and we're out of time. So I'd like to thank our speakers this morning for their really insightful contributions. I think it's certainly given me and hopefully you an awful lot to think about and consider. So thank you, Francesca, Helen, Henri and Matthew. Today's webinar, along with the one we did last week with the Yorkshire Focus, is really the start of a 6-month project that the businessdesk.com is doing with Squire Patton Boggs. So there'll be plenty more webinars, hopefully in-person events towards the end of the project time as well, and lots of articles and analysis on the business desk in the weeks and months ahead. So do keep an eye out for that. But that's all for today. So again, thank you to our speakers and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.